He grabbed the back of my head in front of 200 guests and shoved my face straight down into my own daughter's wedding cake. Then he laughed, loud enough for the whole room to hear, and said, "Try some dessert, beggar." 5 minutes later, that same man was standing in front of me with his hands shaking, begging me not to make one single phone call. My name is Walter Grayson. I'm 61 years old. I own a company most people in Denver drive past every single day and never notice, and for 30 years I made sure it stayed that way. This is the story of what happened at my daughter Emily's wedding and what I did after. I built my company from a rented garage on Brighton Boulevard back when I was 26 years old, with $400 and a used forklift I didn't fully know how to drive. Grayson Industrial Supply started as a small steel and hardware distributor, the kind of place that sold bolts and beams to contractors who needed them fast and didn't want to wait 3 weeks for a shipment. I worked 16-hour days for the first 10 years. I slept in that garage more nights than I slept in my own bed. Slowly, one contract at a time, one honest handshake at a time, the company grew. By the time I turned 40, Grayson Industrial Supply was quietly supplying materials to half the construction projects going up across Colorado. I never chased attention. I never wanted my name on a building or my face on a billboard. I wore the same flannel shirts and work boots I'd worn since I was 26, and I drove the same beat-up Ford pickup truck long after I could have bought the whole dealership. My late wife Carol used to tease me about it. She'd say, "Walter, you could buy this street and you're still wearing a jacket with a hole in the sleeve." I'd just shrug and tell her the truck still ran fine, so why replace it? Carol passed when Emily was 9 years old, and after that it was just the two of us. I raised my daughter the same way I built my business, quietly, carefully, without needing anyone to notice. Emily grew up believing money was something you used, not something you flaunted. She never once knew, until she was old enough to understand tax filings, that her father's name sat quietly on a list of the wealthiest men in the state. I liked it that way. I still do. But that plain, quiet life I built is exactly what walked into a five-star ballroom on my daughter's wedding day and got mistaken for something it never was. Emily was 27 when she met Preston Callahan at a charity gala downtown, one of those events I usually skipped but had gone to that year because a friend was being honored. Preston was tall, well-dressed, with the kind of easy smile that came from growing up never once worrying about money. His family ran Callahan Premier Developments, a real estate company responsible for half the shiny new condo towers rising along the Denver skyline. His father, Richard Callahan, was the kind of man who talked about his own success the way other men talk about the weather, constantly and without being asked. When Emily first brought Preston home to meet me, I shook his hand, looked him in the eye, and asked him what he did for work and what he wanted out of life. He gave me a polished answer about legacy and building something that would last generations. It sounded rehearsed, but I told myself plenty of young men sound rehearsed when they're nervous. Emily was happy. That mattered more to me than anything else. Over the following year, I watched Preston's family size me up in small, quiet ways that I chose to ignore at the time. Richard Callahan would ask me questions about my little supply business, with a tone that made it clear he assumed it was exactly that, little. His wife Diane once asked Emily in front of me whether her father had ever considered a more presentable line of work. I let it go every single time. I've never needed strangers to understand what I've built. I only needed my daughter to be loved the right way. I told myself the Callahans were simply a different kind of family, louder, flashier, more concerned with appearances. I told myself none of that would matter once Preston and Emily were married and building their own life together. I was wrong about a lot of things that year, but I was most wrong about how far Preston was willing to go to make sure everyone in that ballroom knew exactly where he thought I belonged. 3 months before the wedding, the two families had dinner together at a restaurant in Cherry Creek that Richard Callahan picked specifically because he knew the owner. I showed up straight from a site visit at one of our supply yards, wearing jeans and a work jacket because I hadn't had time to change. The moment I walked in, I caught Diane Callahan's eyes flick down to my boots and back up again, the kind of look that doesn't need words attached to it. Richard made a joke early in the dinner about how he hoped Emily had a good job lined up, in case things with the family business didn't work out for her, glancing at me the entire time he said it. Preston laughed along with his father. Emily's hand found mine under the table and squeezed it, her way of telling me she noticed too, and that she was sorry. I squeezed back and said nothing, because I've learned over 61 years that the men who need to announce their worth loudest are usually the ones least sure of it. Near the end of that dinner, Richard leaned across the table and asked me directly what I did, since Emily had apparently never given him a straight answer. I told him the truth, plainly. I said I ran a supply and distribution company and left it exactly there, the same way I always did with strangers who hadn't earned more detail than that. Richard nodded slowly, the kind of nod that says a person has already decided you're beneath their attention, and changed the subject to his newest development downtown, a 40-story tower he said was going to define the Denver skyline for the next 50 years. I listened, ate my dinner, and thought about how a man that certain of his own importance rarely stops to wonder who's actually paying for the steel holding his tower up. I had no idea, sitting at that table, just how true that thought would become in a few short months. I only knew that dinner left a cold feeling in my chest that didn't go away for days. The morning of the wedding, I woke up at 5, same as I do every day, and drove my old Ford pickup to the Aspen Grand Hotel where the ceremony was being held. I could have hired a car. I could have shown up in a suit that cost more than most people's mortgage payments. I chose instead to wear the same charcoal gray suit I'd worn to Carol's funeral 13 years earlier, because it was the one piece of clothing that still felt like it belonged to the man I actually was. When I pulled into the hotel's circular drive, a young valet in a red vest took one look at my truck, one look at me, and told me the guest parking was around back near the loading dock. I didn't argue. I parked where he pointed and walked in through a side entrance past stacks of folding chairs and empty catering carts, past staff setting up centerpieces, until I found the ballroom where my daughter was getting ready to walk down the aisle. Emily looked at me in that dress, and I felt something in my chest tighten in a way I hadn't expected, a mixture of pride and grief, because Carol should have been standing right there beside me watching our daughter get married. Emily hugged me tight and whispered that she was nervous, and I told her the only thing a father can tell his daughter in that moment, that she looked exactly like her mother, and that whatever happened next, I was proud of the woman she'd become. The ceremony itself went smoothly. Preston stood at the altar looking confident and rehearsed, the same way he'd looked the very first day I met him. 200 guests watched Emily walk down that aisle, and for those few minutes, standing beside my daughter, I let myself believe that whatever coldness the Callahans carried toward me didn't matter, because the day belonged to Emily, not to me, and not to them. I had no idea the reception would prove me wrong within the hour. The reception moved into the grand ballroom around 6 in the evening, chandeliers overhead, round tables dressed in white linen, a live band playing something soft, while 200 guests found their seats. I sat near the back corner at a table with a few of Carol's old relatives, exactly where I preferred to be, quiet and out of the spotlight. Richard Callahan, on the other hand, worked the room like he was running for office, shaking hands, laughing loudly at his own jokes, making sure every guest knew this wedding was being hosted, in his words, the Callahan way. When it came time for toasts, Preston stood up with a microphone and thanked his parents first, praising his father's success at length, before finally turning to Emily. He said a few nice things about her, the kind of lines that sound good but don't mean much, and then, almost as an afterthought, he glanced toward my table and said, "And of course, we're glad Walter could make it tonight, dressed for the occasion as always." A ripple of laughter went through some of the tables near the front, the ones filled mostly with Callahan family and business associates. Emily's smile faltered for just a second before she caught herself and laughed it off, the way you do when you're trying to protect everyone else's feelings at once. I raised my glass along with the rest of the room and said nothing, because 35 years in business taught me that reacting to a small jab in public only hands the other man exactly what he wanted. What I didn't know yet was that Preston wasn't finished, and that a joke about my suit was about to turn into something far worse, something that would happen in front of every single person in that ballroom, right as the cake was being cut. After dinner, the staff wheeled out the 5-tier wedding cake, white with gold trim, exactly the kind of cake Emily had dreamed about since she was a little girl. The DJ called everyone's attention to the center of the room, and Preston and Emily stood behind the cake table together, hands wrapped around the same silver knife, cameras raised all around them. Richard Callahan had clearly had several drinks by that point in the evening, and Preston wasn't far behind him. As the two of them cut the first slice, Preston turned toward the crowd with a grin and made another comment, this one about how the Callahan family had spared no expense for the wedding, unlike, he said, glancing my way again, some families who show up looking like they wandered in off a construction site. A few guests laughed uncomfortably. Emily's face went pale, and she reached for Preston's arm to pull him back toward the cake, trying to move things along. I stood up from my table, not to make a scene, but simply to walk over and quietly ask if we could keep the focus on Emily for the rest of the night. That's when it happened. I don't fully know what came over him, whether it was the alcohol, the crowd egging him on, or something uglier that had been sitting under the surface the entire time I'd known him, but as I got close to the cake table, Preston reached out, grabbed the back of my head with one hand, and shoved my face straight down into the top tier of my daughter's wedding cake. The room went completely silent for one full second before people started gasping. Frosting covered my eyes, my nose, dripping down onto my suit jacket, and then, loud enough for every single one of the 200 guests to hear clearly, Preston laughed and said, "Try some dessert, beggar." I stood there for a moment, with cake frosting sliding down my face, and in that silence, I heard my own daughter's voice break as she screamed Preston's name. I wiped my eyes slowly with the back of my hand, giving myself a second to think instead of react, the same discipline that had gotten me through 35 years of hard business decisions. Somewhere near the front of the room, a chair scraped loudly against the floor as someone stood up fast. It was Harold Denning, a man I hadn't seen in almost 2 years, the president of First Colorado Trust, the bank that had financed nearly every one of Callahan Premier Development's major projects over the last decade. Harold and I had sat across from each other in dozens of financing meetings over the years, quiet meetings where nobody but the two of us and a handful of lawyers ever knew my name was attached to the paperwork. Harold's face had gone white. He pointed straight at me, his voice cutting through the stunned silence of the entire ballroom. "Do you people have any idea who that is?" he said, loud enough that even the band stopped playing. "That's Walter Grayson. He owns Grayson Industrial Supply. He's on the state's wealthiest list, and every single steel beam holding up your father's 40-story tower downtown came from his company." A wave of murmurs rolled through the room, guests turning to each other, phones coming out, someone near the back whispering the word billionaire, loud enough for it to spread table to table like a spark catching dry grass. I looked up through the frosting still clinging to my eyebrows and found Preston's face across the cake table. The color drained out of it completely, the confident grin gone in an instant, replaced by something closer to panic. He looked at his father. Richard Callahan stood frozen near the head table, his mouth slightly open, his champagne glass forgotten in his hand, finally understanding exactly what his son had just done, and exactly who he'd done it to. 5 minutes. That's all it took for the entire room to flip completely upside down. 5 minutes earlier, I had been the man in the cheap suit who wandered in off a construction site. Now I stood there, cake still dripping off my chin, and watched 200 guests go absolutely still, watching me the way people watch something they suddenly realize they misjudged badly. Richard Callahan pushed through the crowd toward me, his face flushed red, stammering apologies before he'd even reached me, his hands raised like he was trying to physically stop the moment from becoming any worse than it already was. "Walter, I am so sorry. He's had too much to drink. He didn't mean it. Please, let's step outside and talk about this like reasonable men." Behind him, Preston stood frozen at the cake table, his hand still hovering near the knife, looking at me the way a man looks at a bill he suddenly realizes he can't pay. Emily rushed to my side, grabbing napkins off the nearest table, wiping frosting from my face with shaking hands, tears streaming down her cheeks, repeating, "Dad, I am so sorry," over and over like it was her fault instead of her husband's. I took the napkin gently from her hands and finished wiping my own face, taking my time, letting the silence stretch out across the ballroom, because sometimes silence says more than shouting ever could. I looked at Richard Callahan first, then at Preston, and I said the only thing that came to mind in that moment, calm and level, the same voice I use when I'm closing a business deal worth more money than most people see in a lifetime. "Every single beam in your tower downtown, Richard, comes from my company. Every contract, every shipment, every discount I've quietly given your company over the past 6 years because your son was marrying my daughter." I paused, letting that land. "I think we need to talk. Not tonight. Tomorrow morning, at my office." I left the reception that night without finishing my daughter's wedding, which is one of the harder things I've ever had to do as a father. Emily walked me out to the parking lot, still in her wedding dress, mascara streaked down her face, apologizing the entire way, telling me she had no idea Preston had that kind of cruelty in him, that she was ashamed and heartbroken and didn't know what to do next. I hugged my daughter tight in that parking lot and told her the truth. I told her this wasn't her fault, that a man's true character always shows itself eventually, usually at the exact moment he thinks no one important is watching. I told her to stay at her own wedding, to be with her friends and family who loved her, and that we would talk everything through in the morning, once emotions had settled. I drove home that night in my old Ford pickup with dried frosting still stuck behind my ear, and instead of feeling angry, I felt something colder and steadier settle over me, the same feeling I used to get right before making a major business decision. Anger burns hot and fades fast. What I felt driving home wasn't anger, it was clarity. I thought about every quiet discount I'd given Callahan Premier Developments over 6 years, every material shipment I'd prioritized for Richard's projects ahead of other clients who paid full price on time, all of it done quietly because I loved my daughter and wanted her future in-laws to succeed. I thought about Harold Denning's face at the reception, about how deeply tied First Colorado Trust was to Callahan's financing, and about the 40-story tower downtown that Richard bragged about being his legacy. By the time I pulled into my own driveway, I had already made my decision. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to threaten anyone across a cake table. I was simply going to do what I do best, quietly, carefully, and completely, starting first thing the next morning. At 8 the next morning, I called my head of operations, a woman named Patricia Alvarez who'd worked with me for over 20 years and understood exactly how I handled sensitive matters. I told her to pull every active contract Grayson Industrial Supply had with Callahan Premier Developments and have them on my desk within the hour. There were 4 active projects, including the 40-story tower downtown that was already 3 stories from completion. I also asked Patricia to quietly compile the inspection reports our quality control team had flagged over the past year, reports showing that Callahan's site managers had repeatedly requested cheaper, lower-grade steel substitutes than what the building permits required, cutting corners to save money on a project already running behind schedule. We had documented every request in writing because that's simply how we operate, but because Richard was Preston's father, I had personally overruled our team twice and allowed certain substitutions that, strictly speaking, sat right at the edge of code compliance. That morning, I stopped overruling anything. I called Harold Denning directly, the same man who'd stood up at the wedding and announced my name to the entire room. Harold already knew why I was calling before I said a word. "Walter, I've been expecting this call," he said. I told him plainly that Grayson Industrial Supply was terminating all active contracts with Callahan Premier Developments effective immediately, citing repeated material safety violations we could no longer justify overlooking. I told him our documentation would be made available to city building inspectors and to his bank's risk assessment team, since First Colorado Trust had financed all 4 projects and deserved to know exactly what their money had been quietly building. Harold went quiet on the line for a long moment before he simply said, "Understood. I'll pull our own review immediately." That single phone call, made calmly and without a hint of raised voice, set in motion something far bigger than a canceled contract. It set in motion the collapse of everything Richard Callahan had spent 30 years building his name around. Within 72 hours, city building inspectors arrived unannounced at the downtown tower site, working from Grayson Industrial Supply's documentation showing exactly which floors had received substandard steel reinforcement. The inspection shut the entire project down within a single day, red tags posted across 3 separate floors, construction halted indefinitely, pending a full structural review. First Colorado Trust froze the remaining construction loan the same afternoon, citing what their internal memo called material risk exposure inconsistent with original loan terms. Local news picked up the story by that Friday, a headline running across every Denver outlet asking hard questions about safety violations at one of the city's most anticipated new developments. Richard Callahan's phone, according to Emily, rang constantly for 3 straight days. Reporters, investors, city officials, all asking questions he had no good answers for. Word spread fast through Denver's business community, the same community where Richard had spent decades cultivating a reputation as a bold, can't-miss developer. Investors who'd backed his last 2 projects began pulling out of future deals entirely. A second bank that had extended a smaller line of credit to Callahan Premier Developments called their loan due in full within the week, spooked by the growing headlines. Within 10 days, Richard Callahan's company, the one he'd bragged about defining the Denver skyline for 50 years, was formally under investigation by the city and functionally frozen out of any new financing anywhere in the state. I never made a single public statement. I never gave one interview. I let the documentation, the inspectors, and the bank do exactly what they were designed to do when a company cuts corners and gets caught. Preston, meanwhile, according to Emily, had gone from confident and untouchable to barely leaving his apartment, watching everything his family had built collapse in real time, knowing the entire disaster traced back to one moment at a cake table that he could never take back, no matter how many times he replayed it in his head. 12 days after the wedding, Preston showed up at my office unannounced, without Emily, without his father, just him, wearing a wrinkled shirt and looking like he hadn't slept properly in a week. Patricia buzzed him through after he asked twice, practically begging, and I told her it was fine, since I'd already decided how I wanted this conversation to go. He sat across from my desk and started talking fast, apologizing for the wedding, blaming the alcohol, blaming stress, blaming his father's constant pressure to perform in front of guests, and then, finally, asking me directly if there was anything he could do to stop what was happening to his family's company. I let him finish completely before I said anything at all. Then I told him the truth, plainly, the same way I've told the truth to every business partner I've ever sat across from. I told him I hadn't shut down his father's company out of revenge, and I meant it. I told him I'd simply stop covering for safety violations that should never have been happening in the first place, violations that put construction workers and future residents at real physical risk just to save his father a few dollars per floor. I told him the humiliation at the wedding had shown me clearly what kind of man he actually was underneath the expensive suit, but it was the safety reports that told me what kind of company his father was actually running. Preston sat there, quiet, his hands shaking slightly in his lap, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked like a man with absolutely nothing left to perform for. He asked quietly if I could at least tell the bank it was a misunderstanding. I told him no. I told him some things, once they're out in the open, can't simply be put back the way they were, whether it's a load-bearing beam or a marriage built on cruelty and appearances. He left my office that afternoon without another word, and I never saw him again after that day. Emily filed for an annulment 3 weeks after the wedding, once the full picture of the Callahan family's finances had become public knowledge, and once she'd had time to sit with what Preston had shown her in front of 200 guests. She came over to my house one evening, sat at my kitchen table where Carol used to make Sunday dinners, and told me she'd spent the past few weeks replaying every small moment from the past year, every joke at my expense she'd let slide, every uncomfortable comment from Richard and Diane she'd excused because she wanted her marriage to work. She said she finally understood that Preston hadn't slipped up that night at the cake table. She said the cruelty had always been there underneath, and the wedding had simply been the first time he felt safe enough to let it show in front of everyone. I told her I was proud of her for seeing it clearly, and that it takes real strength to walk away from something everyone expects you to hold on to, even when holding on to it is clearly hurting you. She asked me, quietly, whether I regretted staying so guarded about my own success all those years, whether things might have gone differently if the Callahans had known from the start exactly who they were dealing with. I told her no, I didn't regret it at all, because the whole point of building a quiet life was learning exactly who valued you for the right reasons, and who only valued what you could give them. Preston and his family had shown their true colors the moment they believed I had nothing to offer them but embarrassment. Emily nodded slowly, and for the first time in weeks, I saw something like relief settle across her face instead of grief. She told me she wanted to take real time for herself before thinking about dating again, and I told her that was exactly the right instinct, and that I would be there, quietly, however long that took. 6 months later, Callahan Premier Developments filed for bankruptcy, its assets sold off piece by piece to cover outstanding loans and settlements from the safety violations uncovered during the investigation. Richard Callahan's name, once printed proudly across billboards throughout downtown Denver, quietly disappeared from every project the company had left unfinished. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he and Diane had moved out of state entirely, starting over somewhere far smaller and far quieter than the life they'd built here. I never felt satisfaction watching it happen, only a steady sense that consequences had simply caught up to choices, the same way they always eventually do. Emily moved back closer to home that spring, taking a job at a nonprofit downtown, something meaningful to her that had nothing to do with money or appearances, and I watched my daughter slowly become lighter, more herself, the version of her I remembered from before Preston ever walked into her life. We started having Sunday dinners again at my kitchen table, just the two of us, the same table where Carol used to sit with us years ago, and Emily started laughing again in a way I hadn't heard in over a year. I still wear the same flannel shirts. I still drive the same old Ford pickup, though Patricia keeps threatening to buy me a new one for my birthday whether I like it or not. I never once regretted building a quiet life instead of a loud one, because a quiet life let me see exactly who was standing beside me for the right reasons, and who was only ever standing beside me for what they thought I couldn't give them. My daughter learned that lesson the hardest way possible, in front of 200 wedding guests and a slice of cake she'll never forget. But she learned it, and she came out the other side stronger for it, and as her father, that's really all I ever wanted for her. If this story hit home for you, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe for more real family stories. I'll see you in the next one.